Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com. Climate alarmists know that they can say whatever they want and the press will never ask them any questions. A good example of this are statements made by academic Jonathan Overpeck. The Hill website is supposedly conservative, and they published this editorial from Overpeck 3 weeks ago. He said, "Something highly unusual is happening in the western United States. Record hot temperatures, some above 115 degrees Fahrenheit, recently spanned the southwest northward to the interior west, and now a dangerous heat wave is hitting the Pacific Northwest. The news has been full of references to ongoing western drought and predictions of yet another extreme wildfire year. Even so, in reality, the story is worse. Much of the West, from California east to New Mexico and north into Canada, is now plagued by extreme and exceptional drought. What's worse is that the current summer of drought is merely the most recent manifestation of the nation's first recorded mega drought, a 22-year drought that extends back to the turn of the century." Apparently, Overpeck isn't familiar with the vastly worse droughts of the 1930s, which drove millions of people from the Great Plains to California. This is what eastern Colorado looked like during the 1930s. But right now, eastern Colorado is the greenest I've ever seen it in July. Now let's look at Overpeck's claims about 115-degree weather. This list shows all of the U.S. state temperature records. 10 states have been over 120 degrees Fahrenheit, and all of those records were originally set prior to the year 1940. 24 states have been over 115 degrees Fahrenheit, and all of those records were originally set with CO2 below what's called the safe level of 350 parts per million. 39 states have been above 110 degrees, and every state, including Alaska, has been over 100 degrees. A large percentage of these records were set in 1936, and the vast majority were set before 1940. No state broke their all-time temperature record during last month's heat wave. Overpeck's claims about unprecedented heat simply aren't true. Now let's look at his claims about drought. 3 weeks ago, he said that the Southwest was experiencing an unprecedented drought. But the news out of Arizona is that much of the state is flooded. The forecast into August is for huge amounts of moisture streaming up from the Gulf of Mexico into the Southwest. Overpeck is saying that the Southwest is experiencing an unprecedented drought due to climate change, but the reality is that the Southwest is having one of their wettest summers on record. NOAA still shows Arizona in extreme drought, but the people who are suffering from the floods might have a different opinion. The NOAA map shows Cheyenne, Wyoming, where I live, in extreme drought, but we're actually having one of our wettest years on record, and it's extremely green here. This map is not very credible, but the one from 1934 was. During July 1934, 80% of the U.S. was in drought. Photographic evidence from the 1930s shows the drought pretty clearly. This article was written by the chief meteorologist of the U.S. Weather Bureau on June 22, 1934. Worldwide drought is seen likely. Weatherman admits there's something wrong and that no one knows why. And not only was the drought in the United States, but it actually covered most of the earth. This article was from Australia. World drought, farmers' ruinous losses, almost universal disaster. Europe revives pagan rites. Drought in England. England has just experienced the worst drought for nearly 100 years. The LA Times said, "Whole world in freak weather year of 1934. Cold, heat, drought, and floods set new marks. Unprecedented extremes recorded in every country of the earth. How science accounts for berserk elements." Overpeck says that the flooded Southwest is experiencing its first megadrought. Overpeck came from the University of Arizona, and he should know better based on research which came out of that university. Scientists who study the West's long-term climate patterns say that California has had multiple droughts of 10 or 20 years in a row during the past 1,000 years, and 2 severe mega-droughts of 180 years and 240 years. This was reported in 1994 by the Los Angeles Times, and was reported by the New York Times that same year. New Mexico has had dozens of mega-droughts over the last 2,500 years, including one in the 13th century which wiped out the Anasazi. We could assume that Overpeck is just ignorant of history, but that's not the case. In 2009, he wrote a paper about mega droughts in Africa. This article was from the New York Times. For at least 3,000 years, a drumbeat of potent droughts, far longer and more severe than any experienced recently, have seared a belt of sub-Saharan Africa that's now home to tens of millions of the world's poorest people. The lead authors of the report, Timothy Shanahan of the University of Texas and Jonathan Overpeck of the University of Arizona, warned that global warming resulting from human-generated greenhouse gases was likely to make those droughts worse. But this is complete nonsense. NASA has shown that Earth's getting greener as carbon dioxide increases, and the droughts in Africa are nowhere near as bad as they were 3,000 years ago. It's pretty clear that Overpeck was lying about droughts. Now let's look at this article he wrote yesterday in The Hill. He claims that we're having an unprecedented drought and a record wildfire season. The reality is that the year-to-date burn acreage in the United States is below the 10-year average and less than half of what it was 10 years ago. On this graph showing burn acreage back to 1916, the 2.5 million acres which have burned so far this year would barely show up on the graph. And if we go back to the pre-industrial period from 1500 to 1800, the 2.5 million acres which have burned so far this year would be less than 2% of the annual average. Much of the western United States is being flooded with moisture. It's not going to be a big fire season outside of the West Coast. Overpeck is lying about heat waves, droughts, and fire. So what's his agenda? He tweeted this yesterday. Imagine you are an oil and gas exec and this is what you're working to bequeath future generations. By the end of the century, almost all of the world's corals will be gone if climate change continues at this pace. It's very clear that his goal is to demonize oil and gas and generate hatred against fossil fuel companies. So I tweeted back to him, corals evolved during the Cambrian era with CO2 levels more than 15x current levels and temperatures 10°C warmer. That was when the greatest expansion of sea life occurred. Why are you spreading such gross anti-science misinformation? Coral reefs love warm temperatures and high levels of CO2. Geologic history shows this very clearly. Lots of coral reefs around the world are in bad shape, but it's not because of carbon dioxide. There's lots of other environmental factors which are killing the corals. So answering my own question, Overpeck is spreading anti-science misinformation because he can and because he gets money for doing it. The press has created a protected class of climate misinformers. People like Overpeck can say whatever they want, the press will publish them and never ask them any serious questions. Toto has been pulling back the curtain on this insanity for the past 13 years. You can visit him, Kyrie, and Caesar on the web at realclimatescience.com.